Good morning, everybody. For those of you here, thank you for braving a blustery late November morning. And good morning to everybody who's here via online Zoom. My name is Tom Packer, and I'm speaking as part of the Master Gardener series that the Arboretum holds. And I'd like to thank the Arboretum for having this series and asking me to talk today. And you just heard from Christopher Todd Glenn, the head of programming and education here. And I appreciate him asking me. And in preparing this talk today, it's going to be, I'll prepare you, it's a bit different in that it's not a hands-on practical talk about weeds and what you can necessarily do with them in your yard. I think you'll learn some lessons about how to do that. But I've given a couple of other presentations on weeds, and as part of my work with the Master Gardener program, I handle, have duties handling our gardening helpline, and we get a lot of questions about weeds. And it made me think about taking a different twist on the subject and going back, far back in history to find out about how we came to where we are now with how we approach weeds. But first of all, let me introduce you and essentially make a case of why you should be listening to me in the first place. So I'm a county master gardener, and I'll put a pitch in for our program that for those of you in and around Wake County, we do have a gardening helpline, which you should free to email or call. In any event, that's me sitting in my home office during the pandemic. We held down the gardening helpline and ran it 5 days a week all the way through, and it's continuing now. So think of us when you have any gardening issues that you'd like, you have questions about and like answers to. As far as my background, basically, I guess there's a saying that I'm not from the South, but I got here as fast as I could. So I did not have a career in horticulture, but I got here as fast as I could in that I did practice law in San Francisco and then in Raleigh for a large national firm for 35 years, but had the good fortune of being able to retire and enter the Master Gardening program run through the North Carolina State Cooperative Extension Program, which was excellent training, and have remained active in it. This is just my background since then, that I was fortunate enough to win a sort of a Rookie of the Year award after my first year. And I've been fortunate to become a member of the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Agricultural Programs Foundation Board. If any of you during this holiday season are in the giving mood, this is the foundation through which you can make donations to the Arboretum, to the Extension Program in general, to the Master Gardener Program. I moderate a Facebook group, and also I'm a proud J.C. Ralston volunteer. Here's my badge to prove it. And Catherine Wall, who's attending today, is the leader of the volunteer program here. If you're interested, you should contact here because there's some excellent volunteer opportunities here. I've been able, now that I have the time, to do some writing in the horticultural field. If any of you are interested, here are 4 articles I've written in the past year or so. The last one I actually just published yesterday. Has to do with what I'm talking about today. So if you'd like a little, maybe further in-depth information about our talk today, or you're interested in some of the sources I refer to, citations of those sources, they're all contained in this article, and they're all at these links, and you can check them out. I'm originally not from, as I mentioned, not from the South, not from North Carolina. Although my wife is from Durham. But I grew up in a small agricultural community outside of Fresno, California, which, as you can see in the red X, is between San Francisco and Los Angeles in the Great Central Valley of California, which in Fresno County in particular is typically the #1 agricultural county in the country. in terms of production, types of crops, volume. I grew up with my grandparents settling in the area, and they grew primarily for wine, sometimes for bulk wine, but for raisins, making raisins. Here are my grandparents in 1920. It's my grandfather, Ray, grandmother, Helen. That's my father, the year he was born in 1920, my grandmother's lap. And you can see that they have just recently settled here, and there's nothing on that land. It's very sandy soil. It's bloomed because of irrigation since the late 1800s. But there are no crops yet. There are not even any weeds yet, although there are plenty of tumbleweeds in its natural state. But present day, my cousin is now operating the ranch, and this is what it looks like. It's 80 acres of vines south of Fresno, as I mentioned. You'll notice in the rows here, those are trays of raisins, grapes drying into raisins. I'm happy to buddy how because it's interesting how people really don't know how raisins are made. But there's also an interesting lesson here about weed control that I'll come back in a bit later, because you'll notice there are no weeds in between those rows, just the trays of drying raisins. So let's get on to the subject matter of weeds. I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was asked to give a talk on weeds last year, and it was a pretty straightforward talk on weeds and how to control them, identification of weeds and whatnot. Here's a little weed humor. Weeds don't get any respect in our yards, of course. But weeds have come to be such an important topic because of their effect on agricultural, as well as just our own backyards, and so many homeowners focusing and taking up gardening these days, that there are weed science programs, major universities teaching these around the country that have science programs here at North State. And this is the website that you can go to for NC State's resources on weeds. And it goes on for a few pages. There are also other great resources. In particular, Virginia Tech and Clemson also has great information on weeds. But the way we control weeds over the centuries has come to be a modern day effort and science that people devote their lives to, their careers to. And so these days, we call our attempts to deal with weeds integrated weed management. It's 3 words, a lot of syllables. If you're experienced gardeners, you probably are familiar with the basic tenets or sections of integrated weed management, of cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical management. What's interesting, though, is that how this has evolved. And the purpose of this talk is to go back in time and have a somewhat whimsical but historical look at how humans' efforts to control weeds have got us to where we are today, and the underpinnings of integrated weed management and these different forms. This is a word that you don't hear much, if at all, today. Extirpate, as you can see, means to destroy completely, pull up by the root. How we were back in the 18 or 1700s, when we'd be talking about weed control or writing about weed control, we'd be talking about extirpation. And the main goal then was to find out how best to extirpate weeds. Back then, I think if you went to some farmer or gardener back in Europe, say, and use the phrase integrated weed management, they'd look at you like you didn't know what you're talking about. You'd be from outer space using a phrase like that. But the main goal was to extirpate weeds. I think that it's an excellent, elegant, yet direct word, because what we want to do is to kill weeds. We do want to destroy the weeds we want to have out of our garden. And for various reasons, perhaps we've adopted a lot of euphemisms for that. But extirpate is a very direct word, and who knows, maybe it'll be adopted and we'll have degrees in weed expertation instead of weed science as we go forward. But let me just briefly summarize the main ways that we use our integrated weed management. The first, of course, is cultural management. And as you can see, that involves basically proper planting practices, timing, drip irrigation. Going back to my grandparents' ranch, farm, the reason there are no weeds in between these rows is now because of drip irrigation. They used to, 50 years ago, use flood irrigation. They just let the water go out into the field. They'd flood it from the wells. It's all well water. And it was uneven and water got everywhere. But weeds, of course, need water to grow. But now this is all hooked up to a drip irrigation system. So the water just goes underneath the vines, and the weeds and other pests, nematodes in particular, don't have the water and then the transition into photosynthesis and nutrients to grow. So this is a very good example of cultural management of how we deal with weeds these days. I'm sorry, how deep is it? It's on the ground. Yeah, it's just above the ground. It's tied to the posts and then it's strung along. So it's only an inch or two above the ground. Or it could be, and a lot of times it ends up laying on the ground, but it's not under the soil. This is another example of cultural management, just in our backyards, in a raised bed or whatever, just growing lettuce close together. Weeds need sunshine. They don't have sunshine. Mechanical management, we're all familiar with. That is just basically pulling weeds, somehow destroying them through tools, hand pulling. Mulching is mechanical management. Maintaining weed-free borders, coverings, boards, cardboards, whatnot. This, though, is a present-day YouTube video of how to remove a weed. It takes 2 minutes and 18 seconds for this fellow to remove this weed and tell somebody how to do it. And the point I put this in is that hopefully we will, as we go forward, keep in mind the advances we have made, the science we can follow, and not spend 2 minutes and 18 seconds for each weed we have in our yard. Biological management, goats, chickens, sheep. You see them on hillsides, not too practical for homeowners, really, typically. And it's also been shown that they can create weeds as well because they're eating and then their excrement can cause the seeds to get back into the ground. But it's been used for history. And of course, chemical control. My talk is going to end today at what I'll call the dawn of modern herbicide use in the early 1900s. I'm going to take us up to that point because that can be a whole nother talk, a whole nother section on how modern day chemical herbicides were developed. But just as a short overview, of course, NC State has an agricultural chemicals manual, which contains a lot of information on how to properly and safely use chemicals. Of course, they're selective and non-selective. You need to know. And I'm going to talk about the pre-emergent in a minute. And I'm not going to get into, of course, a lot of weak classes get into discussions of particular chemicals, glyphosate, for example. I'll just refer you for information to a couple of just excellent resources, background resources from NC State about the use of glyphosate if you're interested, but I'm not going to get into it in particular. But we'll see as I get through my talk about how there farmers and gardeners centuries and centuries ago, back to Roman days, were actually using primitive forms of herbicides. Use of herbicides is not a totally modern way of controlling weeds. It's antecedents, its history go back, way back, to use of various materials that I'll show you. But to get us kind of warmed up on going back into history, I want to talk about an interesting way of looking at one aspect of weed control and for other uses as well. But there's some of you may or probably are familiar with the concept of phenology. And as you can see, it's basically observing life cycle phases of plants and animals. And in particular, when we look at plants, it's called phytophenology, the branch of phenology that deals with the seasonal rhythms of plants. And it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, even during the BC area in China. Romans use calendars based on observations of plant life, animal life. There actually are records of Japanese cherry blossom dates, the date they bloom in Japan, dating back to the 9th century that you can look up and people look up. And these calendars were used to plan and also keep time of the seasons. You've heard of you may have heard of Carl Linnaeus, who's responsible essentially for our modern taxonomy way of looking at the botanical classes of plants, kingdoms, orders, species, et cetera. Well, this is just an example of a calendar that he kept for when certain plants bloomed. And he kept track of that so he could keep a better inventory of the classes of plants that he had. But the point I'm making for present day is, remember how I mentioned that I had under chemical control the post-emergent and pre-emergent herbicides, and on our Master Gardener helpline, especially come spring, we do get questions about when should I apply my pre-emergent herbicide. Now, back in history, back in the 1800s, 1700s, and earlier, they didn't have pre-emergent herbicides. That wasn't even a concept then. But we are able now to, and very popular, to control weeds, for example, crabgrass in the late spring and summer, by using pre-emergent herbicides. But the short story I wanted to tell was last year, for example, there was one university recommending that pre-emergence in the spring be applied they used a date system, say March 15th. And this past year, they moved that up to March 1st because they thought that the winters from November to December, for example, were in a warming trend. And so they moved that up by a couple weeks. But what happened was that it turned out that the winter up until end of February, almost the start of spring, was colder than expected. And so the pre-emergence turned out to be not as effective. They ended up using what's called a split pre-emergent, another application later in the spring. And then along came a heavy rains, which washed a lot of it out, which was just to add on to things. But this is just an example. This is for Wake County. These are the temperatures for November to the end of February over the years since 1890. That, well, here, we're right here it's warmer, and they thought it'd be warmer again, but it wasn't. It was colder. And another, though, university just southeast of us over the state line uses a different approach of recommending when pre-emergent herbicides should be used. They go back to phenology, actually, and they basically say when the forsythia bloom, that's when you should apply the pre-emergent herbicides. And this is actually from the university, Clemson, but their point is that crabgrass needs a consistent soil temperature of 55 degrees or more to germinate, and you want the pre-emergent put in so that it doesn't germinate. Now, most gardeners don't take temperatures of their soils. It's an inexact science. It's hard. So you do look at the 65 to 75 degree air temperature, which translates into the soil temperature of 55 degrees. And that's where some people and universities think, well, that's typically around March 15th or another date that they try and pick. But as we saw, using a specific date is difficult due to annual climate variability. And so the other university recommends and says that a good indicator for when to put down a pre-emergent is when you see the forsythia blooming. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I thought you were late.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
So, Phytula villosa, very crafty, is the one that I want. It's invasive from Asia. Do you know, does it follow the crabgrass schedule? Or like, how do I find out?
Right. It's called, yeah, I don't know in particular. It's called hairy crabgrass or crab leaf.
It's in the line.
Yeah, you'd have to look that up. And I would look that, if you were calling me on a helpline, I would look that up in particular. I'm referring now to the general crabgrass that's been here forever, it seems like. But every weed does have a temperature in the soil, which will turn it into germination. And that's what you want to catch. That's, so in any event, this is just an example of how historical ways of doing things, going back to the BC era and Japan keeping track of its cherry blossoms, can translate into a modern day concept that maybe it seems like an old tale or something, when something blooms, but it is based on science and is, to me at least, more reflective of what happens from year to year. And I think perhaps better than picking an arbitrary date or the same date each year, or try to guess what the date is going to be. Because as we saw before, the temperatures are going to go up and down. So this is the main thrust of the talk. As you can see, this is a pile of weeds off to the right. And I titled the talk Herba Inutillis, because this is a Latin phrase, that's how they describe weeds back in Roman times, basically. Herba means grass. And there is a word that I frankly don't use, inutile, that comes from this, but it means useless, worthless, disadvantageous, harmful. And basically a weed is defined as such. If we go way back in time, at least in biblical writings, weeds are mentioned. Adam was promised thorns and thistles because of what he did. Jonah had trouble navigating water weeds before his experience with the whale. There's in the New Testament, there's the parable of the tares, which essentially has to do with one's enemy sneaking in at night, spreading tares, which is a kind of a weed, into grain crops and ruining the crop, and as punishment for something the farmer had done. And this is a depiction of it. While the farmer slept, his enemy sowed these weeds in his field. this is terrace, this is wheat. You can't tell the difference because they'd all grow together and you wouldn't know what to weed out. But I think one of the main points, though, by this, just before this time, though, is that at one time in history, there was no such thing as a weed. If you think about it, weeds are a human construct. When we were hunter-gatherers, pre-agriculture, we were just concerned with hunting and gathering whatever lay on the ground. We weren't growing anything, we weren't planting anything. This is way back, of course, but the concept of managed cultivation and agriculture hadn't come into being yet. So everything was a plant out there, and it didn't become a weed until the first stabilized agriculture came along, which is thought to be around 6,000 BC in this area, around the in Mesopotamia and the Nile River in Egypt. And once humans started planting, then they had something invested in what they were planting and wanted to fend off. They wanted to destroy anything that attacked what they were planting, and that became the concept of weeds came into notion. And this is in around 3000 BC. Some of the first implements were invented, typically for agricultural purposes, not necessarily for weeding. This is an ancient hand sickle. This is a T-shaped wooden tool that could be pulled by laborers. If you attach leather to it, eventually animals can pull it. And they started to, humans started to devise various instruments to help them plant, and ancillary to that, to cut weeds. But back then, though, agriculture was essentially casting seeds out onto the ground, not like we know. The straight lines of my grandparents' ranch that you saw did not exist back then. The weeds, the unwanted plants, the Herba Inutillis, were all mixed in with the plants. So it was very inefficient way of dealing, and it held back the advance of agriculture and humans' production of food back then. These were examples of ancient tools that were used. This is obviously a hoe. Burning of crops was common, but that also had the benefit of burning weeds that were left over, weed seeds. So that had a double purpose. And then around the first century, when agricultural civilization had progressed to a certain point during Roman times, and a lot of the available literature that I could find talks about Roman times and coming up to Europe, although we'll take a quick detour through Asia briefly. But the planters, and again, gardens were not a big deal. Maybe some royalty back then would have a special garden, but it was agriculture, growing something for food, not flowers for pleasure or whatnot. Nonetheless, these are some forms of the early herbicides, basically, that were in use, that were found sort of by serendipity, if you will. There's a olive oil, tree sap, grease. This depicts grease on the right-hand side. So there's discussion in the literature about use of these 2,000 years ago, but not particularly for the destruction of weeds. What was taking place, though, in Asia was where rice is the main commodity, that they were using grass carp. And so this fish would swim among the rice paddies and eat the weeds, eat the unwanted grass, and would not eat the stronger shafts of the rice. And this was probably, who knows, and it's probably found, these fish somehow got into a rice paddy from a pond or river. The farmers found that this happened. And as a cultural way of controlling weeds, the Asian farmers reportedly also began growing rice seedlings, if you will, and transplanting those instead of direct sowing seeds into the rice paddies so that the rice had a head start over the weeds. And so that, with their grass carp, was the way they approached at least this part of weed control. But going back to the, yes, ma'am. Yeah, the question is whether they're still using grass carp today in Asia. And I don't know for sure. The literature I found didn't bring us up to date whether they're doing that. I would think, though, that if someone is growing organic rice, that they may very well be doing that. I'm sure that there have been chemicals used in the rice paddies around the world, not just Asia. But I wouldn't be surprised if certain types of rice, especially where they value certain strains of rice and want to be able to represent that they're grown naturally, that this could be used. There's no reason that it can't be used. And there's also an aftermarket for the fish too that they can be used as well. The Romans made olive oil, as we all know, and part of the process of making olive oil is pressing the olive oil. And I don't know if they had EVO back then or not, but they made olive oil, and part of the residue, the very last part, the watery dregs or the lees, was called a merca. And they found that whatever this drained out of these large olive oil presses, that everything died. You could see a trail of everything dying from where this dregs, a merca, went. And it could have had something to do with because they were known to add salt when they pressed olives. They weren't quite sure, but in any event, this was one of the first notions that the farmers, the food producers could make something that could help them control plants in some way, and is also known to control voles and moles, reportedly as well. In the first 1,000 years or so from the sort of the Roman Empire, from AD for the first 1,000 years, there is not, that I could find, a lot of literature on weed control. But what there is references salt as it's the most available thing to use, and it was being used because it was thought that it would kill weeds. It also killed plants. But some of the things that were used during this time as people experimented with controlling weeds included salt, a mixture of salt and duck excrement, mixtures of herbs and salt, even salt and human excrement. But it was gradually learned that salt, when it dissolved especially, would just kill everything around it. It wasn't very efficient. It's hard to control. So they started, though, to use salt more particularly on their examples of dropping it only on the crowns of thistles, for example, instead of just spreading it. Only using it over gravel walks or paths, applying it to fallow land in the fall, and mixing certain amounts with seed. But generally, salt sort of had its heyday as an herbicide, but was found to be unsatisfactory just because it couldn't be controlled and it was too widespread and would kill plants. But sort of from a sociological point of view, it seemed to be that by this time, by the Roman Empire through the next several hundred years, the approach was there's an abundance of labor. And so most of the weed control was mechanical. That was the primary approach in dealing with weeds. And there wasn't a lot written scientifically about weeds in particular yet. And as we can see, though, and as we'll get to, more efficient, smarter ways of controlling weeds, led to just better utilization and better achievement of purposes of humans, because they didn't have to spend so much time in the field. Children, for example, could go to school instead of being forced to clean out fields and weed fields, which was a common occurrence and a repeating theme as we'll see more. So moving on from this, as agriculture became more and more important, embedded in society as a way of producing food, not just for yourself, but now for others to sell it within your own community, within your own country. In the 1200s, in the year 1212, for example, was one of the first known laws against weeds in Scotland. And the Scottish government imposed severe penalties to those who seeded weeds on land or who did not destroy certain weeds. And enforcement evidently became very effective because this part of Scotland became known for its premium grains and cereals once it had instituted this law against weeds. And however they did it, the Scottish people pulled a lot of weeds and got a lot of weeds out of the ground. And this part of Scotland became known. And then as we go further in time, as literature expands, as the arts and science expands, as the printing press is invented, and everything that follows from that, now we see more references in ancient or modern day ancient literature about farming, about gardening, and about weeds. And of course, Shakespeare, who was in the 1600s, gets into the act. And there's a scene from Richard III where you can see talking about noisome weeds. And then, of course, King Lear and his crown of weeds. And as you can see, there's a passage from King Lear talking about burdocks, hemlock, nettles, cuckoo flowers, as weeds were called from the day. And so just in what popular media and literature there was back then, just the notion of weeds as being something evil and to be contended with started to be seen more frequently. There was evidently a very renowned poetic agricultural writer who wrote, weeding slacketh, good husbandry lacketh. Husbandry being, of course, everything having to do on a farm and producing food. During this time, more attempts to find out how to deal with weeds other than just using physical labor were looked at. This is soot or ashes. They were used to combat weeds, to smother them. There were soap boiler ashes, which contained alkaline and lye, turned out to be fairly effective and was commonly used in the British Isles during this day. Chalk was tried. Lime was also used, and which could be effective by making the soil more alkaline and thus suppressing the plant species adapted to more acidic soils. So they were, kind of crude science was developing, a lot of trial and error during this time. And there is mention during this time in the 1500s of using a mixture of iron and sulfur. So again, they're thinking of ways other than labor to combat weeds and using some primitive herbicides. But the mechanical means still carried the day, and weeds were still a plague of farmers and the burgeoning class of gardeners, especially in Europe and the British Isles, that was emerging during this time. This fellow from the 1700s is credited often with starting what was called the British Agricultural Revolution, which eventually a lot of its concepts transferred over to America, eventually, which would be natural that it would. He is credited with a number of things, with improving the process of agriculture and food production in the British Isles, and also controlling weeds. And I'll give you a clue as to his name if nobody recognizes him. I don't know how many of you would know one of my favorite English rock bands, but he's the namesake for Jethro Tull. Just as it turns out, I don't know exactly how that came about, but this fellow is Jethro Tull. And he was agriculturist, lived until 1741. He invented the seed planter, which you'll see had a very important effect on weeds. And he urged eradication of weeds throughout England's farms and gardens. This is one of his publications. It's a fourth edition that came out after his death. What's interesting, though, is I found this through I mentioned before the Weed Science Society of America did a survey of historical literature about weeds, and I found it on their website, the professor who found this. But it's interesting that this is from the John Adams Library in Boston. This is a scan of the original document. So who knows if that is John Adams' signature or not, because this document is from the from the 1700s. But some of these writings that you'll be seeing are reproductions of these original documents from the time. So Jethro Tull basically put a bullseye on the back of weeds in England and challenged farmers and gardeners to do something about them. He was against cutting weeds. He thought they'd come back, like he said, multi-headed hydras, especially if they'd seeded. But he chronicled various ways of extirpating weeds throughout the land. And for example, here he wrote, as you can see, that plants that come up in any land of a different kind from the sown, of course, the F's are S's, from the sown or planted crop are weeds. And he wrote that the farmer who expects to make a profit of his land from what he sows or plants in it finds not only Herba, Inutillis, but also other unprofitable and hurtful weeds that always hurt and often spoil his crop by devouring what he has by his labor in dunging and tilling, providing for his sustenance. And then he concludes by saying all weeds as such are pernicious, but some such more than others, some do more injury, and some are more easily destroyed, some do less injury, and all are harder to kill. Others there are which have both their bad qualities. He also wrote that "'tis needless to go about to compute the value of the damage weeds do, since all experienced husbandmen know it to be very great, and would unanimously agree to extirpate their whole race as entirely as in England they have done the wolves, though much more innocent and less rapacious than weeds." And then he says, if we consider the crops they utterly destroy and those they extremely diminish, and that very few crops escape without receiving injury from them, it may be a question whether the mischief weeds do to our corn is not as great as the value of the rent of all the arable lands in England. So he is laying down the gauntlet at this time to take on weeds throughout England. This is a diagram of his most famous invention, which was the plant or seed drill. And the drill did a simple thing. It planted for the first time automatically the seeds in straight rows. Before the drill, as I mentioned before, the seeds were often sown and scattered in the field, and the weeds and everything would be mixed within it. But now anything that didn't grow in the straight rows was considered unwanted, was a weed. And horses eventually could draw these, and it greatly increased the efficiency of agriculture in England. But more than that, it allowed farmers and laborers to discern what was a weed and what wasn't. They didn't have to choose between a terrace and a shaft of wheat and decide which is which. He also designed a horse-drawn plow, which would send the weeds over to the side for them to dry out in the sun and die. And these are the various tools that were being used during this time, again, in the 1700s in England. They look fairly familiar to what we use today. In particular, though, if you look at numbers 8 and 9, these are tools for, it's cut off on the bottom there, but for use in lawns. And this is one of the first mention of using tools for gardening purposes. So these could be used for uprooting dandelions, essentially, and those types of weeds in lawns. So now they're talking not just about farming, but they're moving into the area where more people are having gardens or lawns, which are very popular in England back then. Weeds, as we've been talking about, really are a plant, and they can have their own beauty. During this time, from 1771, an illustration from Elizabeth Blackwell of a mayweed, which is just beautifully hand drawn. I've always been blown away by people who can do something like this just by hand. But people were finding out about weeds now that they were in publications and the social media of the day. They were seeing plants identified not as plants, but as weeds in particular. So moving forward a bit to the early 1800s, then 1806, this was a communication to the Board of Agriculture that exists today and has fortunately it has been scanned. But the writer of this, as you can see, writes about on the subject of weeding or the improvements to be effected in agriculture by the extirpation of weeds. And Mr. William Pitt of Wolverhampton, England, wrote this. He wrote that the cleaning of all kinds of crops and keeping them free from weeds is an essential part of cultivation, and that it's become an important part of farming. And goes on to say that, and again, he's using the very direct words of the day. He's calling the weeds the principal intruders into the garden, and that many other sorts will occasionally appear from seeds wasted by the wind, as well as be introduced by using raw dung, particularly of hogs and horses, which often contain seeds possessing their vegetative power, and the litter intermixed therewith often contains more. He says much labor in weeding will be saved by particular attention in drawing up all seedlings in time and before they have sown their seeds. For the increase of many weeds in this way is beyond calculation, and the precaution of preventing their seeding there should therefore never on any count be neglected. And then he says the tools principally used in the gardens of Staffordshire, at least, for destroying weeds are the spade, the three-fanged fork, the different kinds of hoes, and the Dutch hoe for scuffling the surface, the common hose of a triangular form that we have now, for example, or for cutting up weeds. And this is still what was being done, at least by the early 1800s, by way of dealing with weeds. And then he goes through particular types of weeds. He mentions one just as an example of the kind of the attitude of the day. He talks about coltsfoot. He writes, Lord Hawke informed me at the Board of Agriculture that the only time to destroy this weed is by cutting it up in those months where it begins to throw out its flower, at which time, if so cut, it will bleed to death. So the very direct and language used just indicates how different it is from today with the euphemisms that we have that they mean business. Then this goes on to 1820, I believe, that this is a essay on the weeds of agriculture. And the reason this is in here is that there's a letter that he reproduces just by a farmer who's asking, would any of your numerous correspondents point out a work or book of reference for the destruction of weeds to which a young farmer might refer? And so at least by the early 1800s, 1823, the farmers were still operating by word of mouth. There was no manual. There's no NC State website to look to for all the answers. It's still word of mouth, and the publications piecemeal that are starting to come out, but really aren't out yet to guide anyone along these lines. So as the years go on, this is an example of a bill from the 1860s in Ireland. And I don't know how many of you have dealt with present day local homeowners associations. They have nothing over this bill in Ireland, which made weeds illegal, essentially. That it provided that a landowner can give notice to any adjoining property owner to cut down and destroy weeds on the property. And it has to state the type of weed to be removed, the places where the weed is growing, and the notice has to be served like a summons, like a legal suit. And then the landowner has 14 days to extirpate the weeds or be subject to a severe financial penalty. And if the weeds aren't removed, then the justice himself or whoever he orders can come into the property and remove the weeds. So this is how, like back in Scotland, 1200, there are more other countries now, including Ireland, are passing laws essentially outlawing weeds and mandating their destruction if it's brought to anybody's attention. Yes?
So I'm wondering who paid for that removal of the offending weeds?
Good question.
Good. I would assume it came from two places, just taxes collected, the general fund, or if they ended up fining, they were big on fines. There's this, I ran across some other examples of in England of laws like this where the sheriff's deputies could collect the fines and then go have dinner and drinks at the pub, paid for by the fines. And they became so efficient, and the people became so efficient as eradicating the weeds that the sheriff's deputies were complaining that they couldn't have their dinner anymore. So I think they depended on fines a lot for a lot of this. Sticking with Ireland, up to 1875, this is what I thought it was a really interesting publication. This is an annual report on the agricultural statistics in Ireland. And they had a special appendix, as you can see, containing information regarding the extirpation of weeds. And this appendix starts out with recommendations on how to rid Ireland of weeds. And what was their first recommendation? Kids. I'll read to you from it. I beg to mention that having brought this subject before the commissioners of national education and suggested to them the many advantages that must arise by instructing their teachers to direct the attention of the children in the numerous schools under their control to the importance of destroying weeds when found growing on their parents' farms. So they're indoctrinating these kids to go to their parents' farms and pull weeds under penalty probably of shame or being reported to the principal. This wasn't only just to the public schools as well. There's also reference to this program being introduced through the religious schools in Ireland, and back then also to the workhouses, which were not uncommon back then, and which children would find themselves in. And this goes back to the example of how reliance on pure mechanical weeding throughout the world can really impose a burden on certain categories of humans, especially children, upon whose burden it fell. Instead of being in school, they're pulling weeds. This report also said weeding should be done as early as possible, either with the horse hoe, common hoe, or sometimes the Dutch hoe. And one thus early cut down may safely be left to wither on the ground. But it should be borne in mind that if any individual plants amongst them are shedding their seed at the time and are not taken away, the very hoeing ensures its safe plantation. So we still rely on that now these days, that if you're going to hoe weeds, don't hoe them when they have a bunch of seeds on them. You're just going to spread them. It should be done early. Now, this appendix goes on, interestingly, to quote a very famous figure in literature. I may have given it away. He's not a namesake of a rock and roll band this time. But the study goes on to say that, and on this subject, one of our most observant and popular authors, the late Charles Dickens, weighed in on weeds. Who would have known that? But he weighed in on them very directly and, in essence, sort of declared war on weeds by writing that it is a case of war arising out of territorial aggression. The farmer seized upon a territory occupied by various races of plants known to them by the rough general name of the weeds. The weeds are got under, subdued, in a great measure extirpated, and the farmers then set up an iron rule over the soil upon which they establish in rich colonies their own subjects, the cereals and green crops. The farmers justify their first aggression. The well-being of mankind depends, they say, on the predominance of the two races of cereals and green crops. But what do the weeds care for this reasoning? The race of man has always trampled on them. They are the first owners of the soil. They claim it. They watch, therefore, the opportunity to rise, and every great rising of the weeds is attended with a frightful massacre of the new race. There is no mercy shown even to the newly born, whether of the green crops or the cereals. Thousands upon thousands of them are without pity, smothered by the weeds, while others perish in their prime. So I don't know if that's exactly along the lines of Oliver Twist and his other writings, but I never knew that Charles Dickens felt so strongly about weeds, but the Irish certainly used it to advance their cause. And lastly, for this report, there was an articulate and impassioned conclusion that has to do with the crusade of weeds, and essentially it says that in Ireland that it is impossible to deny the accuracy of the statement that, as far as weeds are concerned, Ireland is the wealthiest country in the world. And the good farmer is worried and deprived of the just fruits of his skill and labor by the mere fact of their bad neighborhood. The evil is almost universal. So today's writings about weeds are a bit more subdued, a bit more clinical and scientific. I kind of miss some of this writing about making, just a world, an evil around the world of these weeds constitute and what needs to be done about them. But that's how the British agricultural revolution was proceeding, at least by this time. But now that we're in the late 1800s, let's jump over to the United States. And I picked this one because you can see there, this is a fellow, Gerald McCarthy, back in 1892, writing from the North Carolina Experiment Station. Back in the time, I don't know exactly who they were connected with because there wasn't a USDA yet, and there certainly wasn't a cooperative extension service. But there were agricultural experiment stations, and this fellow may have been a bit lonely back then and was writing about weeds. But he came up with a whole list of definitions of weeds. And it seems like we have, throughout time, been trying to define what a weed is. He has, as you can see up there, it's a plant where you don't want it, a plant out of place, a troublesome plant, a plant for which we have no use as far as we know. His definition that he came up with was that any plant which from its situation or inherent properties is hurtful to human interests, a vegetable malefactor. And then this is an 1892 bulletin from another experiment station, but this time up in West Virginia. And I wanted to highlight this in that, again, the time, 1892, herbicides aren't in use. There's some crude experiments going on. But this has some interesting comments about the use of chemicals as weed exterminators. Again, this is 1892. It goes on for some time about using salt. And salt was on everybody's mind then about an herbicide, but it goes through the problems of using salt. That it certainly kills the vegetation, but it must be used in great quantity and therefore be applicable only to very limited areas. And then it goes on to say that the use of coal, oil, or kerosene as a weed exterminator can't be recommended because it proves too costly. And at the same time, only effective when poured liberally upon small areas of soil. It lastly mentions sulfuric acid being used at this time, and it says it will kill any weed of no matter of what nature, as strong as it is, but must be applied directly to each individual rootstock whose eradication is desired, thus rendering the process a tedious and costly one. And so it was concluded, at least by this time, 1895, that, and this is a quote from the bulletin, that experience and experiment have conclusively proven that any extended use of chemicals as weed killers is always attended by more expense and more labor than the results can possibly compensate for. So as a country, at least, and the same was over in Europe, we weren't quite ready to make that leap yet. It's still too crude, primitive, is causing too much harm. And of course, it's a whole pendulum if you want to get into the big scheme of things in terms of how herbicides are used and what possible harm they can cause. But for now, they think herbicides are too harmful and too crude. The USDA in 1895 comes out with a publication, 200 weeds, how to know them and how to kill them. And again, you don't see titles like that these days, but they were trying to get their point across, and that's how they did it. Again, illustrations continue of weeds. This is from 1887, of a common ragweed, but it looks like a very beautiful plant and very intricate drawing with the roots. So weeds have taken their place among all other flora that are being illustrated. It's just that if you turn them around, again, they have a bullseye on their back by most farmers and gardeners. The USDA again comes out in 1905 with weeds and how to kill them. And then around this time in 1897, just to again give you a flavor at the end of that century, of the 19th century, the USDA came out with the 25 most harmful weeds in the country. So now they're making a list of the 25 most harmful weeds. I'll just mention 2 or 3 of them. They mentioned, and how to deal with them. They mentioned bindweed or bear bind, English bindweed, morning glory, and methods of control and eradication. So by the end of the 19th century, they're recommending frequent hoeing or spudding, thorough continued cultivation, application of coal oil or carbolic acid, or thick seeding with smothering crops. The dandelion, they recommend pulling or repeated spudding in lawns, probably with those like tools that we saw earlier. And then thirdly, they also mentioned wild onion or crow garlic, field garlic, wild garlic, cultivation with hoed crops meaning basically hand-planted crops, alternating with dense growing legumes, or application of carbolic acid. So they're kind of all over the place by this time in recommending what to do. Hopping briefly back over the pond, in 1910, a publication came out of Common Weeds of the Farm and Garden. And it's just interesting to note how England's approach had changed now over the years. From the early, remember, I think it was 1823, there's a farmer writing in, there's no manual, what do we do? It's mostly mechanical. They're using kids mostly to pull weeds, ratting out their parents. So now we move, though, into 1910, and this publication they still recommended various planting and cultivation strategies. They talked about the mechanical tools you could still use, but they had another section about special methods, and that included irrigation, helping the crops grow stronger, crowding out the weeds, draining water, which makes sense from where the weeds are growing in low-lying areas. They recommend sheep. There's a lot of sheep in England to be used where appropriate. Use of large sheets of tarred paper to block out the light. They come back to say collection of weeds by school children, offering prizes to school children for collecting certain types of weeds. So that's still in vogue. But they also talk about spraying with plant poisons, sulfate of copper, carbolic acid, on lawns using sand mixed with sulfate of ammonia. So they're moving towards more non-mechanical agents, more use of chemicals, and they're starting to confine the use of chemicals to the gravel paths and drives, controlled areas. They also recommend boiling water and yellow arsenic sheep dip. I don't know if you've ever know what a cattle or sheep dip are. I do from where I grew up. But a sheep dip is where you fill a cement trough full of chemicals because you want them immersed in these chemicals to prevent pests that bore into their leather and their skin, or their hide rather. Basically, you just run them through, make them swim for their lives through this dip, and they come out drenched in this dip. So they're recommending using that on plants at this time. There's still no official widespread manual, though, for dealing with weeds. Until 1919, I don't know if this is necessarily the first manual ever, but it is an early manual that came out of Cornell University through their agricultural program. As you can see, it's a manual of weeds. And within it, they have a diagram of the various tools that are now being used in the early 1900s. This is only 100 years ago, little 110 years ago. And a lot of the tools look the same as have been used over the course of history. They have in the bottom left-hand corner, is the plow. They have a cultivator, which looks very much like Jethro Tull's invention of keeping rows straight so you know where the weeds are. The manual starts out with the age-old question, what is a weed? And it says a weed is a plant that is growing where it is desired that something else shall grow. It follows that a plant may be a weed in some places and not in others. So it's somewhat stating the obvious, but this manual goes through some general principles, which I'll just highlight. And the principles include allowing no weeds to ripen to seeds, kill while in the seedling stage if possible, for then the weeds die most easily and in the greatest numbers. Never plow under weeds bearing mature seeds. That goes for gardens too, with a hoe. Call in the aid of grazing animals, particularly sheep. Practice rotation of crops. Continued growing of one crop not only exhausts the soil, but serves to thoroughly infest it with the weeds that most commonly grow with that crop. And I think we as gardeners could learn from that as well, even in a small plot. They talk about chemical herbicides. This manual talks about chemical herbicides. And it's interesting that it says this is a comparatively new way of fighting weeds, and further experiment is needed for discovery of all its merits. Professor Henley L. Bodley, botanist at the State Experiment Station of North Dakota. You think the Raleigh Experiment Station was lonely, but the South Dakota one was very desolate, but stated that the preliminary field trials at this station in 1896 were perhaps the first experiments of the kind conducted in any country. So, little did we know that in the very late 1800s, early 1900s, the first field trials of herbicides were being conducted in South Dakota. And lastly, they also mention caustic soda, but they mention arsenite of soda. And it concludes by saying this is a very active poison and extreme care needs to be exercised in its use. Do not inhale the powdered drug when making the solution or the spray as it's delivered. Keep to the windward side while working with it. The formula for this solution is 1 pound of the drug and 3 to 9 gallons of water. These arsenical compounds are the chief ingredients of all commercial weed killers. So arsenic. And are used on walks, roadways, tennis courts, and all places where the complete and lasting extirpation of all plant growth is required. So you can see the shift being foreshadowed here by this 1919 manual of increased use of herbicides and less use of mechanical means for both farms and gardens. The one thing you'll note that they didn't mention in that manual is the use of children, which I consider to be a great advance in things. Not that they weren't used. I know I work on a farm pulling some Johnson grass. It's not fun, but this is the dawn of the herbicide era now. We've talked about the agricultural cultivation era starting in Mesopotamia back in 6000 BC and going through the Roman age up to the year 1000, and then the explosion of literature. At least I'm sure a lot was going on. I couldn't locate a lot of literature about it going on elsewhere, but up through Northern Africa, the Nile Basin, up through Europe, up to the British Isles, and then transferred to here. And the movement away from more mechanical means to more chemical means along the way using cultural and biological methods. But all these sources have taken the time all the time to define what a weed is. And so I want to end with one example of how times can change, though, in that regard. We now, for example, regard crabgrass as a weed. I don't think maybe someone does, maybe grows crabgrass they think it looks nice and whatnot. But generally, it's an example of a weed that everybody regards as unwanted as a weed. But back just 100 years ago, there was a plant that was once desired. The USDA came out with a publication extolling its virtues. It noted that it was a native of Japan that thrived well in the eastern half of the US, where summers are warm and moist with great luxuriance. It's an excellent vine for arbors and porches, for which purpose it is commonly cultivated in most of the southern cities. And it's also useful for grazing and forage crops. It's a substitute for hay, very nutritious, being comparable to clover and alfalfa. Again, this is 1920. And that's exactly what this bulletin says. It's the greatest thing that they've seen in a long time. And it goes on to describe it and have pictures of lovely fields of kudzu. Of course, 50 years later, it's described as the vine that ate the South, with a reputation as the fastest growing vine in the United States. Safe to say, though, it has to date eluded extirpation, and as we know, still exists. But this takes us up till this period of time in 1920, when the weed science, the new dawn of weed science, is about to start. But I hope this is a little different take, a little bit of history on the roots, if you will, of our integrated weed management these days and the cultural, mechanical, biological ways that we deal with weeds. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention in person and online. And if you ever have any questions of me personally, there's my email address. And everybody have a good day, and thanks very much. Yes.
Dandelions have gotten better reputation than they used to have. As a child, I pulled dandelions out of my father's lawn. But I was in, Poland about 30 years ago, and they had fields of it. They were growing for an agricultural crop. When that is an agricultural crop versus wheat, I had assumed in Europe that it had been popular as a beneficial plant forever. I don't know when that change happened.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. The question is specifically about dandelions when they became regarded as a weed instead of a useful crop, and that could apply to some other plants or weeds as well. One thing I did find in preparing this talk is I didn't go into it because it would have sidetracked us too much, but a lot of these plants and weeds that have been mentioned also have medicinal properties, for example, which were used back in more ancient days than they are now. I remember, I've heard of and kind of have an image of dandelion tea, for example, being made. I don't know when that shift occurred. I think now, a dandelion is a good example of a plant that can be both a weed or a plant. Like this last definition from that 1919 manual, a weed is a plant where you don't want it. If people are growing dandelions, like in Poland, I assume they have a use for it as a, as a tea of some sorts. There's been an explosion, of course, in the past 20, 30 years of herbal teas, dandelion being among them. There's been more experimentation of medicinal uses of plants, taking the DNA from plants to use for medicine. So I can see dandelion falling into that property. Around here, people see dandelions pop up and don't want them in the first place to pop up, use a pre-emergent or use one of those tools to get them out. So, but that is a good example though, how things cross over.
I don't believe, like, in the Roman times, because you gave an example during those periods of dandelion. I wasn't sure if we were using that just as an understanding example, or that you knew that they took out dandelions back then.
Right. I know this last USDA publication I referred to was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And dandelion is one of the 25 most wanted weeds in America. So at least the U.S. Department of Agriculture was regarding dandelions as a national weed to be extirpated. Now, I would imagine, though, back in, say, Roman times, they used everything that they could from an animal that was killed or from the ground, and either by trial and error or whatnot. There's many more examples of plants being used for some sort of medicinal purpose of solving a wound or treating asthma or whatnot. I don't know. But I would have a feeling that dandelions look so special coming up out of the ground compared to a lot of other weeds that some smart Roman would think, what could we use this for? And that was just, in follow-up to the question of, were the Romans using these or around that time period using these types of plants for anything else other than considered weeds?
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you very much for all of the wonderful online audience for joining us today. We did have a small audience here in person, but I did want to let Tom know that while they were small, we do have a record number of online attendees now for a Master Gardener lecture.
All right, thank you, everybody.
But thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day. And we look forward to seeing you online on Wednesday for this week's Midweek Plant Lovers Tour. We'll see you then. Have a great day and enjoy the beginning of December. I guess that's tomorrow or the next day.
Right.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Right, bye-bye.